All right, good morning to the early bird crowd. Thank you for being here. Thanks to those of you who came back and for those of you who are just joining us today. I'm Katie Glenn Bass. I'm the research director at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia. And I'd like to introduce Professor George Deodatis, who will be giving our opening remarks today. He is the Santiago and Robertina Calatrava Family Professor of Civil Engineering and Professor of Earth and Environmental Engineering, as well as the Vice Dean for Research at Columbia Engineering. Columbia Engineering is our co-sponsor for this symposium. We're really very grateful for their support and the broader partnership that the Knight Institute has with them. One of the great benefits of being based at a world-class university is the opportunity to work with so many different disciplines and so many different areas of study. So, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Welcome to the second day of the Knight First Amendment Institute Symposium on Artificial Intelligence and Democratic Freedoms. This symposium gathers some of today's most distinguished and insightful voices on the topic of advanced artificial intelligence systems and the challenges they bring to democracies. And these challenges are multiple. Columbia Engineering has been organizing many efforts and activities like this one to look at AI through different lenses. For example, last month, we had a university-wide AI summit focused on multiple facets of AI, from how AI can address the climate crisis to the role of AI in leadership and urban tech, to questions about the role of AI in higher education. Today, thanks to the critically important work of KFAI, we continue by looking at AI and democracy. I'd like to thank KFAI for hosting this event, as well as our organizers for their hard work in making today possible. I'd also like to thank all of today's presenters from all over the world, as well as from major industry partners. At Columbia, we truly believe that innovation and insight come from bringing diverse disciplines together. With AI, this type of collaboration across disciplines is more important than ever. It is truly a transformative technology that has affected and will affect every aspect of our society. And especially about these two fields, First Amendment scholars and AI scholars, these are two groups that usually do not interact a lot with each other. And bringing them together, I believe, is going to open new opportunities, create new ideas for both of these fields. So I'm very honored to be here welcoming all of you to this symposium. I trust that now, in the middle of our current climate, today's presentations will spark many lively and interesting discussions. Thank you again for joining us here today, and have an absolutely wonderful symposium.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to invite our first panel of the day to the stage, and I will turn things over to my Knight Institute colleague, Nadine Farid Johnson, who will be moderating this panel.
Thank you, Katie, and good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see all of you, and I'm very excited about this morning's panel. So special thanks to all of you who came in on the early side of the day. I will introduce our esteemed panelists briefly and then start us off with a few questions to get things going and have our panelists discuss their really incredible and thought-provoking papers for you. In the middle here is Sacha Altay, who is an experimental psychologist working on misinformation, trust, and social media in the Digital Democracy Lab at the University of Zurich. His research focuses on understanding why some false beliefs are widespread, and he tests novel communication techniques to correct common misperceptions about vaccines, GMOs, and nuclear energy. Joshua P. Darr is an associate professor at the Newhouse School of Public Communications and a senior researcher in the Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship at Syracuse University. His research focuses on local news, partisan polarization, and campaign strategy. Darr was the recipient of the Andrew Carnegie Fellowship in 2022 for his project investigating how newspapers can earn back trust and reduce political polarization. Manon Revel is a postdoctoral AI researcher at Meta Fair and a research affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Her research, spanning social choice theory and political philosophy, provides mathematical frameworks to analyze and enhance democratic processes online and offline. Ranjit Singh is a senior researcher with the AI on the Ground team at the Data and Society Research Institute. His work explores the ordinary ethics of exercising human agency and navigating AI-driven systems. His research sits at the intersection of AI infrastructures, majority world scholarship, and public policy using interview-based qualitative sociology and multi-sided ethnography. Glad to have you all here. So our panel this morning, as you can see, is reframing AI in the digital public sphere. And we're going to talk about today, framing this in the fact that democracies depend, as we know, on a vibrant public sphere. And no social institution has been more shaped by narrow AI than that digital public sphere, by most accounts to its detriment. So this panel asks if more capable general purpose AI systems can do better. And one thing you'll hear in these papers is a discussion of what role the public has to play in all of this. So it's something we'll talk about. And I'll, as a kind of a scene setting here, each of you touches upon the bigger picture issues that are at play in terms of our democracy and how there are questions about how the use of AI can enable, distract from, or perhaps mitigate those issues. But because I'm an eternal optimist, because you have to be in the policy work that I do, I actually read your works as offering collectively some avenues to not only responsible uses of generative AI, but also uses that help reassert citizen engagement in furtherance of democratic norms. And I'm hoping we can dive into your papers and expand a bit on what types of next steps we are needed to bring your ideas to fruition, whether that's through platforms, through civil society, through developers, or through lawmakers. So Ranjit, I'd like to start with you, because your positioning of the current debates about AI governance within the Dewey-Lippmann tension could not be more timely. I'm going to read to you a quote from a Guardian piece from a few years back, and I'd love for you to share your reaction to it and then talk with us about your paper, please. So this is a quote from the Guardian. This is from 2018. Reality has become so fractured, it's no longer entirely clear if democratic processes built for a different information age can still deliver effective government. Dictatorships are loving it. They point out that democracies have become too messy to make up their collective minds. Instead, they argue, the digital age is much better suited to dictatorship. Centralize all the data, give up all your privacy, and then let the leader use tech to decide how to design the ideal city or choose the best policy. And then channeling Lippmann, the author continues, modern society was too complex, too media distorted, and the public too easily manipulated to trust democracy. A small technocratic elite should control things. Apart from the fact that that sounds terribly frightening in the moment, I'd love for you to give us your reaction to that and talk a little bit about your paper, please.
Thank you. You set the stage for the conversation really well, especially because we are talking about reframing AI in the digital public sphere. There are ways by which we can actually parse through the way in which the quote itself kind of speaks to this current moment of thinking about what's at stake when it comes to thinking about AI as it intersects with democracy. And the core question that we are trying to answer here is that what should be the relationship between the public and experts in a world which is overflowing with information, and yet we would like it to be anchored in democratic values. Right. And then the second question that we can actually think about is what are the conditions under which a public can basically meaningfully govern and, and think about democracy in the context of AI. So these are actually the core questions that the paper that we have written for the symposium actually speaks to. It's a collaborative project between Data and Society Research Institute and the AI Risk Vulnerability Alliance. One of my co-authors is here, Bo, hi. And Jake is traveling and he couldn't make it to this wonderful symposium. What I'm going to do is to basically talk a little bit about the paper and how it speaks to the question that you've raised. But I also want to note that the paper is already published on the Knight Foundation website. You can have a look at it at your convenience. So the two questions that I raised, right? One about the relationship between experts and the public writ large, and second about what does it mean to democratically govern AI are fundamentally not new questions, right? It kind of extends what Arvind was saying yesterday, that AI is a normal technology. There are ways in which these questions have risen for literally every technology that we have seen over the last 50 years, 100 years, because the debate itself between Dewey and Lippmann is 100 years old, more or less, right? So let's revisit the classic debate between Walter Lippmann and Dewey. And there is a lot of nuance here, but I'm going to simplify it for the sake of brevity. Put simply, Lippmann believed that modern life was too complex for ordinary people to make informed decisions. And in his view, democracy needed expert management. And this was a debate, so predictably, Dewey disagreed. He saw public as something that emerges from when people face shared problems, and believe that democracy thrives when we create spaces for people to deliberate and demand accountability. So partly the question is that, does the public need to know everything in order to be able to make informed decisions about things? And Dewey's position was public doesn't need to know everything. It needs to know the problems that it faces and express its interests in the face of the problems that it is actually contending with. So, and we see a version of this debate playing itself out in the growing field of public red teaming for generative AI. So these exercises are efforts to invite members of ordinary public to evaluate and reflect on the behavior of generative AI systems. And at the heart of these exercises are two crucial questions. Who gets to define what counts as harm? And who decides what makes a system safe? Now you can see how both of these questions are fundamentally questions of the relationship between experts and the public and what does it mean to democratically govern AI. So, and hence they have, deep implications for what we think about democracy in the first place, right? There's a clear broad consensus here, even among people who develop these technologies, that what counts as harmful should not be decided by tech companies that build these systems. So it's not that, we are fighting a battle where, we are trying to basically assert accountability. There is broader recognition of the idea that the harms of these systems need to actually come from the public, and there needs to be an ongoing articulation of what this harm looks like. So, in this sense, we see these public red teaming events as sites to grapple with these core issues of what counts as harm and what makes systems safe. And while they differ considerably in style and emphasis, they generally follow a very simple procedure. You invite a bunch of people, give them access to a system, ask them to probe for misbehavior and potential ways in which systems can basically break, and then think about what these results mean for the design of future models. There's a do-and impulse here, right? Publics are organizing around problems that affect them. But the actual mitigation of harm still often lies with experts, echoing Lippmann's view. To make sense of this dynamic, we distinguish between two modes of public feedback that are at play in the organization of these events. The first is instrumental feedback that scales down public concerns and translating them into metrics and data sets that developers can use to improve models. And the second is deliberative public feedback, which scales up and transforms specific failures into broader discussions about priorities, values, and accountability. So we don't see one kind of feedback as being superior to other kinds of feedback. What we see is that they're complementing each other in the process of basically figuring out how we can accountably govern generative AI systems. So in the interest of concluding my initial reflections on the paper and the provocation that Nadine raised, let me end with two reflections. The first one, these events are sites for the emergence of what we call as experimental publics. These are emergent and provisional collectives of people which are structured around sociotechnical systems. Second, the tension between Dewey and Lippmann over the role of public and experts in organizing for democracies is not a simple opposition. It represents a spectrum of possibilities between technocracy, where the rule is governed by experts, to self-governance, where you collectively make decisions about technologies. Navigating the spectrum requires both scaling down public concerns into micro-scale representations that experts can reconcile, and scaling up opportunities of deliberation, allowing the public to engage with macro-scale consequences of these decisions. In functioning democracies, this interplay between scaling down of concerns and scaling up concerns is fundamental to sustaining public experimentalism. Put more simply, while scientific expertise is foundational for modern democracy, democracy itself is foundational to scientific advancement. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. I think this is a good time to point out that giant QR code, so please use it to ask questions, because I know there will be a number of questions that are coming out of this discussion. So Sacha, I'm going to turn to you, because you discussed the skewed public discourse around AI and elections, and you warn of how it can distract from other more pressing issues. So as kind of an overarching question, I'm interested in your take about how we can have discussions, conversations like this one today at the symposium productively and effectively, knowing that we have that bit of a dichotomy.
Maybe it makes sense for me to answer this question after my presentation.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Great. Please go ahead.
Amazing. Thank you. You hear me well? Cool. So yeah, I think it makes sense to answer this question after having presented the data. So I'm going to present this paper with Félix Simon, who is actually the AI expert here. I'm mostly a misinformation and persuasion expert, not exactly AI. So we started working on this because Félix told me, look, there are a lot of headlines about like AI deep fakes, like completely destroying democracy. And, you know, in 2024, more than half of the world population went voting, and ChatGPT got democratized. Like more and more people use ChatGPT. And so there were many headlines about how this would completely destroy the electoral process and democracy at large, and societies even sometimes. And so Félix was like, hey, maybe we need to write something about that, because I think it's bogus. And the number of papers of news articles on AI and generative AI has exploded after the democratization of ChatGPT. And we see that many of these articles in orange are about generative AI. So there is more and more talk in the news about generative AI in the US. And a lot of this coverage in orange here is actually negative. Like 46% of the coverage is negative, only 17% is positive. So there is a lot of worry about the generative AI and its effects. Here are two graphs just to show you that there has been an increase in the news coverage of AI and election. On the top graph, there are more and more articles, news articles being published on AI and election, to the point that as of 2023, there have been more articles published on artificial intelligence and generative AI than climate change or climate crisis, which I think is a little worrying. And our main point in the paper is that fears about the impact of AI on elections are overblown. It doesn't mean, of course, that AI won't have impacts on election. We just say that these fears, most of these fears that have been voiced, are overblown. And I'm just going to make three arguments. We make many more in the paper, but I'm just going to make three that I think are important to understand our points of why we should maybe worry less about the impact of AI on election. The first one is that quantity of information does not matter. A lot of people were worried about AI because AI allowed the creation of content, like it's easier with ChatGPT and all the LLMs to create content, and people were like, oh, so we are going to be flooded with misinformation. How are people going to deal with that? And I think quantity does not matter. I think the bottleneck is attention. It's not because there is more misinformation that people will consume more of it or people will believe more of it. I think misinformation is largely demand-driven. Increasing the supply of misinformation won't increase the demand. It's not because there is more of a good that people will buy more of that good. People need to be willing to buy it and consume it. And I think what makes misinformation consumers special is not that they have privileged access to misinformation. Misinformation is free, is available everywhere. Like it's very easy to access. There is no paywall. But I think what makes misinformation consumers special is that they have traits that makes them more likely to seek out misinformation, such as having low trust in institutions or being strong partisans. And you may think, oh, maybe it's algorithm, it's filter bubbles, etc. But there are many articles now showing that when people are exposed to hyper-partisan or misinformation headlines, for instance, it's because they look for it. They look for keywords, they click on it, it's not because of algorithmic recommendation. And so despite the quantity and accessibility of misinformation, the average internet user consumes very little of it. It may be surprising, but since 2016, there have been many papers estimating the quantity of misinformation in the daily media diet of people, and basically it's very little. People consume very little news, but when they consume news, they mostly turn to mainstream news outlets and consume very little misinformation. The second point I'm going to make is that quality does not really matter. So basically, LLMs, of course, allow content creation, like allows you to create content that's of higher quality at lowest cost, etc. And so people are like, oh my God, what's going to happen if we can have super realistic false images or videos? And I don't think quality really matters. I think demand for misinformation is very easy to satisfy. And the most viral misinformation is very unsophisticated, such as this piece that Elon Musk shared, or what Trump said about just watch for voter fraud, because we win without voter fraud. We win easily. There is no need for quality. There is no need for AI here. There is just good old lies. And for quality deepfakes to have an influence, people need to be exposed to it. And I think that's super important. For content to have an influence, people need to be exposed to it. Yet, to learn about the world, people mostly turn to mainstream news. Even though they distrust mainstream news, people still turn on the TV and watch mainstream news. And I think mainstream news is unlikely to use AI in misleading ways to manipulate voters. And I think most often quality is not the point. When you look at the content of misinformation, what matters is the narrative it supports. So if you're racist, you're going to look for misinformation that supports your racist view. If you're xenophobic, etc., what matters is the narrative it supports, not the content itself. And I think realistic fakes is not a new problem. We have been able to tell lies forever, to write false text forever. Since the history of photography, we have been able to make false photography, and we still use language, we still use text, and we still use photography. Why? Because we have come up with norms, social norms about how to use this technology, how to use language, how to use text, so that it is authentic and so that it's valuable. The last point is, I think personalization matters a bit less than we think, because LLMs and AI allows content to be more personalized. But the effects of micro-targeting, despite what we may have heard about Cambridge Analytica, etc., are actually very small and context-dependent. And people recognize and dislike highly targeted messages. They are fine if it's a little bit targeted, like based on geolocalization, for instance, but they really dislike it if it's like too specific, such as based on their political identities. And we have some evidence now suggesting that better LLMs, like more performant models, do not necessarily translate into better persuasiveness. So there are sharp diminishing returns in like how much a model is doing better and how persuasive it is. So it's not because we have like models that are 100 times better that it will be 100 times more persuasive. They are sharp diminishing returns. And read the paper for more about it, and I think it's the occasion for me to answer your question. So in the paper, we also discuss background information about voting behavior and psychology, mostly that basically influencing people is quite hard, especially in the context of elections. Like people are not gullible, and voting behaviors are determined by various factors where information often plays a very little role. We also discussed how AI was used during the 2024 election. It's very sparse evidence and not super convincing, but we discuss it and also how people use it. We discussed the reasons for the skewed discourse, like why is this happen, and the consequence of this skewed discourse. And I think to answer your question, focusing on AI may distract from more like structural and long-standing threats to election and democracy, including voter disenfranchisement, attacks on election integrity, intimidation of election voters, attacks on journalists and politicians, and various forms of state oppression. And I think there's another risk that if we focus too much on AI and election, we also overlook other harms, such as how AI is used to harass minorities and women. We know, for instance, at least before ChatGPT, that most deepfakes were about non-consensual porn used to basically put famous faces of women on pornographic videos. And we know now that a lot of AI and deepfakes are used for non-consensual pornography. And I think it may harm society and women way more than how AI is being used. In the context of election, notably because in the context of election, often AI has been used to illustrate what people say and to basically do like soft propaganda portraying leaders as strong and opponents as stupid. But I don't think it's a very convincing use of AI, and I'm more worried about how AI has been used to target minorities or women, for instance, than election. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Josh, I'm going to turn to you now because you, in your paper, you note the risks of AI for democracy mirror the risks of American government, and you talk about autocratic centralization or ungovernable decentralization. And given that your paper talks about local news, I'd love if you could kind of tease that out in terms of how that principle, that tension, plays out in the local news realm.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. So technological tools like AI arrive into a political context that has existed for a long time, that is accompanied by a media environment, a structural formation of media that has existed alongside it. And so in America, that means a federalist system of government where you could argue one of the central stories of the country is the tension between national and state and local governments in terms of who is controlling policy, who implements policy, and how sort of equitable those policies might be. And so when the national government is, let's say, very active, we're at a time where that is both true politically and from a media perspective. So while we hear a lot about the travails of the journalism industry these days, it's a pretty good time to be a national news outlet in some ways because you have a very easy to reach nationwide market, and national news, there's never been more of it, whether it's high quality or not. It is a golden era for at least text-based national news being available to people, and you see this with the success of the New York Times and how many people they're able to employ and the increasing reach that they're able to have. So the story is, of course, very different at the local level, where we still have a fairly active policymaking and policy implementation system that fits with the federalist nature of the country. We have people who are, who need things from their city councils that technically that's politics, but it doesn't have very much to do with what's going on nationally. And at this time, we have really never seen such a crisis facing local media. It cannot be overstated. A quarter of journalists have lost their jobs in the last decade. We've lost thousands of newspapers, many of them weekly newspapers, many of them serving areas that are not otherwise well served by other places. Traditional daily newspapers have declined, and they've had to sort of switch their focus. Hedge funds now own more than half the newspapers that more than half Americans read, and they're sort of squeezing them dry. So we have this mismatch that's emerging between the amount of media coverage at the local level, in terms of the amount of governing that's being done, and the amount of media coverage nationally, where there's a lot of media coverage of a lot of action nationally, but we're not seeing as much locally. And so that's bad civically. That matters a lot. When local news is better, polarization is lower, there's less corruption, both in the political and the business spheres in that community. There's lower political participation. Municipal bond ratings are worse, you name it. There's so much good research showing the negative effects of local news collapsing. And so some of that has to do with the story that journalists sort of like to tell, which is that, we provide the information. If people get good information, they make good political decisions. If they don't, they don't. Therefore, we are very important. Some of that is not really that story. Some of that is the politicians in that community feel like they're being watched. And that is somewhat simple. That could be by their constituents, that could be by the media. Often they look to the media to understand how their constituents are viewing them, right? Because they can't run polls in some of these very small areas. And so I want to approach the question of AI in local news, trying to be as clear-eyed as we can about what exactly those civic benefits are of local news in terms of how to preserve them, and how AI and other technological tools can reduce the costs of supplying those civic benefits, rather than simply saying, let's use AI to, quote, save local journalism, and perhaps in doing so, reinforce some, practices and styles of journalism that were formed during a very different economic context when they enjoyed monopolies in the local environment in terms of advertising. There were a few more profitable things you could do than own a local newspaper back in the day. And as a result, the coverage that they produced served that market, but perhaps not the civic needs of the people within the community that they were serving, right? So where does AI fit within this new paradigm where the optimistic take is that we have the chance to sort of rebuild something more civically useful and perhaps cheaper from the ashes of what local journalism supplied? And so there are some tendencies emerging. Of course, AI is being used in local news. There's some very good thoughts being made about that in various think tanks and academic organizations. There's lots of people trying stuff, which is always good. But I worry that one of the main tendencies of traditional local news was to target their coverage towards wealthier and therefore, in many cases, whiter areas of their audience. Because those are the people that the advertisers who supplied 80% of revenues to local newspapers wanted to reach, and those were the people who were paying to subscribe to the paper as well. And so from an economic perspective, those are the people whose interests should be served. As a result, less advantaged communities were portrayed as very negatively through the lens of crime, through the lens of decay. When journalists showed up, people would say, who died? Right, because they were not trusted, they were not well viewed in those areas. And I'm worried that some of the initial thrusts of AI into this area are possibly reinforcing that. The one case example that I can think of is that apparently real estate trends is something AI is very good at because the data is very readily available. You can compare it to past data. You can say, here's where the house prices are going in an area, and that's all well and good if you own a house. And then, of course, if you own a house, you're more likely to show up to city government meetings. There's some very good work out of BU that shows this, that people who show up to meetings and therefore have their voices represented in front of politicians are more likely to be homeowners. So, if real estate data is leading to reinforced inequalities that resemble more of local news's past than its future, maybe we need to look at what data is easily available to make news for using AI and whether or not that's achieving our goals. The benefits of participatory journalism as a contrast, which is sort of what my paper was mostly about, rests on a different system that's being used in more and more cities nationally, which is this program, in my example, known as Documenters, where people are paid to go take notes on city government meetings and then report those back to a news organization who writes stories based on the notes. And this sounds simple, but it is a really fundamental reorganization of how news stories are made and how they're selected. And so if we adopt this perspective of, one, putting people in the room, they're often the only people in the room. City council meetings are not well attended, especially subcommittee meetings. So it's harder to, it's hard to think of a clearer way to make representatives feel like they're being watched than actually watching them. The information that they get is perhaps more useful in that it is coming from, not from journalists, but from people who are interested in city government, interested in how it works, interested in implementing those examples. So, as one example from the paper, and it's more of an anecdote than generalizable data, I trained a chat GPT on documenters' notes from the city of Cleveland, and then I just asked sort of general ChatGPT some questions about a pretty common thing that can happen, which is that you get a building code violation or a code violation on your property, and you have to answer for that, or else your property might get taken away in front of the Board of Building Code Standards. The one based on documenters' notes was very different. It pointed out you need to actually show up. It is extremely important that you show up. You will lose your appeal if you don't show up. And it also noted that if you don't have the financial resources to show up, to take a day off of work, or to make the repairs that are needed, there is assistance available, right? These are the things that actually came up in the actual meetings. These are not the things that are on the city website, which is what ChatGPT's normal features gave me in response to the same question. clevelandohio.gov did not tell you how to do something. It told you where to find things. And that's very different and a very different level of usefulness. And so this notion of perspective, of coming at your government, wanting to use it in a way that helps you live your life better, to take advantage of policy as it currently stands, rather than thinking like a journalist and saying, well, what's going to happen, or did what just happened work, I think is something that we need to think about as we think about what the technological tools might be for the future. And so this notion of arriving to city government without a lot of expertise, perhaps, and without relying on official resources, but as part of a perhaps naive public trying to figure out what it looks like, I think that there's a lot of value in that. And if to the extent that AI tools can help us do that and adopt that perspective and focus more on usefulness than newsworthiness, I think we may be in for a better future from what we can expect from local news. And I'm interested to know how possible those things are and where this stuff might be going.
Thank you so much. Keep the questions coming. I see them piling up here, so it's great. Manon, your work examines better means to ensure representation in online discourse, and you do this via a system of justified ranking in the comment section. I think all of us know not to read the comments. So I'm curious about what led you to this work and how we can see improvement in this.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Nadine and Katy and Seth for bringing us together. I'm really grateful to all of you for this opportunity. I'll walk through some of my slides, but I'll just start by answering your question. And for this, I would like to take us back to something that Spencer Overton talked about yesterday when we were talking about this idea of common ground technologies. And I'm really excited about them. I think that they're amazing opportunities and a new kind of knowledge about our social world that we can access with these. I also think that sometimes there are legitimate perspectives that are not part of the common ground set that ought to be represented. And for me, Nadine, that was the motivation of this work, is with thinking that as much as common ground is really important, and it's great that we have technologies that surface common grounds, sometimes we also need other kinds of tools that are about representing the plurality, and sometimes the non-overlapping plurality and people who just have completely distinct opinions. Also grateful to my collaborators from Meta, with whom I've been working on this. And how do you click? It's here. Oh, awesome, thank you. All right, so thinking back just, and about the argument that I was making about representation, there is of course a fairness argument. It is fair that different voices are represented, but there is also a kind of instrumental deliberation argument where it is hard for us to meaningfully make sense of our collective differences as we actually don't see a good representation of the plurality of opinions. And so deliberation, very important part of democracy, and for us to collectively make sense. Henry Farrell has this very interesting sentence about having malformed public that just don't understand where they stand in respect to one another. Now, of course, a lot of deliberation today happens online through social media posts, and specifically, I'll talk here about social media comments. So let's say you have someone who posted something and people who answer these comments. The way in which we understand the terms of the debate often comes based on what we actually see and the kind of context that we just observe online. The question is very simple. We ask, how should we rank comments? If you have users who have different preferences, by preference, I will just say whether someone liked a comment. A question that we ask is, how should we pick the comments that appear, and eventually, how should we order them? Very simple question. It's really, how should we understand the term of the debates we are part of? Existing approach include, for instance, engagement, where you pick the comments that are liked by the most people. Bridging-based ranking, where you identify groups that have distinct opinions, and you try to surface the common ground comments, the ones that are liked by people across these groups that are otherwise very dissimilar. You also have a civility-based approach, where you don't actually leverage the comments, the like patterns on the comments. You train a classifier, which is an algorithm that predicts how civil a text is. So typically you have comments that are labeled as civil, not civil, and then you train a classifier on these. So all of these approaches are different ways in which you can think about ranking comments. What we found in running experiments is that if you look at the proportion of users that are not represented in feeds using this different approach, it can get pretty high. So we have up to sometimes a third of the users in a given discussion that happen to be left out. And by left out, I mean that they didn't like or approve of any of the comments that were being surfaced. And these feeds might have really important intrinsic guarantees and properties on the one hand. They just like this particular feature sometimes of representation. And what we care about here is to develop a tool so that if you care in your particular community or platform about representation, we'd like to provide ways to actually get to this. Otherwise, you just effectively might just left a voice out of the table. So how do we do this? How can we build representative feeds? The idea is pretty simple. Let's say that you have just 3 buckets, so you have 3 comments that you can use. We want to basically have something along the lines of proportional representation. We would like to say that everyone who represents some proportion of the population should be represented. Now, in practice, proportional representation is really hard. Let's say that we have a feed with 3 comments, and the users to represent is all of us here, and we each like a completely distinct comment. There is nothing that will be proportionally representative, just because it's just one person, we are more than 3, and we only have 3 slots here. So how can we approximate proportional representation? The idea is very simple. You have 3 spots. If you have a group that's about a third of the population, we should say that this group deserves representation. So for any group that represents a third, and by represent, I mean that they all like in common something, they just deserve to have a comment that represents them. That's an approximation for proportional representation. And also, it's actually tapping into a mathematical definition of representation. It's an axiom. And we can show that you always can find a feed that satisfies this axiom. So the idea is that you have a theoretical guarantee and an algorithmic procedure that makes sure that your feed is representative. And then once you've satisfied all of the group that here represent about a third of your group, you can keep adding the comments that maximize the objective that you cared about on the other hand, whether engagement or bridging or classifier-based approach. So we can effectively build a field with the highest engagement, bridging, civility score while ensuring representativeness. So in fact, our algorithms allow us to maximize a given objective function that you have, conditional on picking a feed that actually satisfies a theoretical, mathematically defined axiom for representation. That's an approximation for proportional representation. And what we find is that the proportion of users that we don't represent greatly drops with this approach, leaving only a few % of users not represented. So overall, we provide an algorithm that optimizes, as I said, some function while ensuring representation. We analyze the theoretical trade-offs. One important thing here is that we find that in practice, the comments that are actually representative often score high in these other metrics. So the price that you pay for enforcing representation is very low. You're actually not sacrificing the other objectives that you have. So it comes at a low cost. So there's no reason not to do it. And we demonstrate empirically with data from actual ranking that we indeed improve representation. And I would say that there are three perhaps key features here that for me stand out is that one, it's completely exogenous. And that's the same for engagement or bridging based. That is, you only use the information that people gave you. There is no external information that decides how you should select or rank. It's simple. The axiom is actually a very nice mathematical definition from social choice. The way in which you can implement it is very simple, very simply explainable. And for me, in AI, simplicity is often one of the biggest underrated desiderata in our more tech communities. And last, we have these theoretical guarantees. So we have a tool that can enforce this notion of representation, hopefully making sure that we have more people and more voices represented. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Manon, I know you just wrapped. I'm actually really curious about this because, well, all of you. So much of what you're doing is, you're looking to expand knowledge, understanding, discourse, deliberation, and ultimately representation in various ways. And I'm curious about, as I mentioned at the outset, how we can see these come to fruition. So I'm curious from your perspective, Manon, what do you see as any barriers to adoption or enforcement of the ranking system by platforms?
I think it is a great question. I'm part of the research organization, the research side of things, so I think a lot about design and not as much, I think, yet about theory of changes. I think something that I found really interesting, and it's in general something that's in the DNA of the team that Max has built, who's on the first slide, is having systems with theoretical guarantees is something that I think we didn't have as much. So we had, I think, a lot of very well, very nice, a lot of nicely designed system and with empirical grounding, for which we didn't necessarily have this kind of theoretical guarantees. And something that I think is interesting is to develop systems with more theoretical guarantees and then hopefully start seeing them more implemented.
Great, thank you. So we have several questions. I'm going to start with a broad question that any of you can take. And our participant asks, is AI inherently democratic because it is trained on our data? Similar to how a president is representation of the will of the people, AI can be argued is a direct representation of the people. How do you feel about that?
Well, if you kind of think about it, if the broad data set on which AI is trained is from the internet doesn't represent everybody. So in a fundamental way, the assumption that because it's trained on certain kinds of data that people have produced, that doesn't necessarily mean that that data is representative of the population that it's trying to represent. So in a more fundamental sense, we have a challenge here. But at the same time, part of the way in which we think about some of these issues is also about what does it mean to actually represent? And, this is clearly what Manon is trying to basically think through in a way, right? How do we actually think about what representation means and how we think through the contests over representation as they emerge in the way in which these technologies develop and the kinds of outputs that they produce, right? So there are ways by which we can potentially think about mitigation strategies like the one that created the whole controversy over Gemini images of Black Nazi soldiers, which was kind of fundamentally a mitigation technique of adding diversity and representation into a prompt, which you when the user entered it, it wasn't designed to do that, but it was added at the end later on by developers, and even that to a certain extent as a mitigation strategy only works in certain contexts. So part of the question here is also about what do we value? How do we actually say this is representative of the kinds of representation that we would ideally like to have in the world, and allows us to basically say that this represents us in a way. And those questions are up for debate, and they will be continuously up for debate. I'm not saying that we will solve this problem. I'm saying that the fact that we haven't solved this problem actually says a lot about why our democracy is functioning in a way. If somebody says that this problem is solved, you can imagine that in that moment we have hit a death knell on democracy.
Please.
Yeah, I'll take that too, because I think that direct relationship between person and political decision ignores institutions and ignores the way that people's choices are determined for them by the fact that things are going through these institutions, right? The president becomes the party's nominee by going through the party's process, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, sometimes, getting the right number of delegates. Republicans have different delegate allocations than Democrats do, right? These are processes that are designed to solve collective action problems that give people choices. And I think that the way that information is structured is not so different in some ways. It comes through government organizations. Some of them are making their PDF searchable. Some of them are not doing anything about that, Some of them are relying on journalists. Some of them have very, very active ways of supplying open data. Just try to look at the differences in every state's voter file, and you will see some of what I mean about what data is available, whether it's free or $30,000 like it is in Alabama, right? Like these are questions that have institutional backgrounds to them. And so if we assume a direct relationship where there's a relationship that's mediated by institutions, we miss the ways that those institutions might not be fully democratic or may be distorting the information we have. And I think that making that distortion quicker and easier to access through AI is likely to exaggerate that more than it is to solve it.
Thank you. Sacha, you discussed the Sisyphean cycle of technology panics in your paper. And you talk a little bit about the discourse around elections and how that was essentially an extension of that. And we have a question here that says, we've also come across other studies making similar claims about the impact of social media on elections in terms of the influence of AI being overestimated. These findings seem to challenge the widespread belief that new technologies have a decisive role in shaping electoral results. In your view, what explains this disconnect between the public perception and the academic research?
It's a tough question, and to be honest, it's true that social media has been there for a long time, and we still know very little about it, and most of what we know is in the US. But I share the view that, of course, like new information technologies have like much weaker effect than we think on like stuff like democracy. It fundamentally shapes how we communicate, etc. But it doesn't like brainwash people, and it doesn't like make people vote for Trump or whatever. Why is it the case? I don't know. I'm actually writing grants about that. I want to understand why it's the case, because when you look at historically, like with the introduction of like the printing press, the radio, the telephone, the television, every time these new technologies came up, there were like fears that they would completely change like the morals of people, the families, like basically completely change society. And in the end, it did not. I'm not exactly sure why. I have some intuitions. Some of them are just that these are very salient. And of course, these things have an effect. Like everyone is on social media, everyone uses it, etc. So you see it, and it's something that you can touch and that you can point to. And it's something that we collectively agree. Also, what I find interesting is that often there is some collective agreement that, I don't know, like algorithms have an effect and are bad. Social media have an effect and are bad. And I think it's easy, like when you have, I don't know, 2016 election, Trump is elected, everyone is super surprised, and it's like, oh, it must be because of some Facebook ads. And once like Democrats agree on that, it's like, oh, we don't need to do much work, we have a solution, we understand the problem and we can move on. And I think most people don't have the time to like understand deeply why these problems occur, and they need solutions. And when people collectively agree on it, I think there is some value to that. But to be honest, it's very speculative, and I don't have it's a very difficult answer.
We'll look forward to your research. Any funders in the room? Josh, there are two questions here that are aimed at you. I'm going to try to synthesize them a bit, because it's looking at potentially one option here through the Blue Sky AT protocol. And they say, do you see as the kind of algorithmic choice that Blue Sky's AT protocol enables that can be a way for local journalism services to create algorithms and related service to increase local and participative journalism as a renewed component of an online public sphere? And then secondarily, there's a question here about, really one can argue that AI is developed to suppress local news and to encourage convenient means of obtaining news content that would not be local via business deals or what have you. So how do you balance using AI for participatory journalism when the same tools are not equitable in their news representation? And do you see something positive, perhaps, in the Blue Sky protocol?
the blue sky protocol. I talked about how great naive approaches are because I'm not super up on these things. But I think that if we're talking about local peculiarities, local differences, local governance has not always, many cases, has not been overall a good thing for rights and for administration of policies in fair and equal ways. It is where a lot of the governing is happening, however. And if we're not accounting for that in the ways that local information is surfaced, either through perhaps algorithmic ways of finding information and determining what is newsworthy or not, right? A lot of the time, this is just journalist news judgment that they learn in journalism schools like the one I work in, but that are sort of like, this is news and this isn't. You have to sift through a world of information. What's put in front of you is one part of that, but then what you choose to make news is the other. And so again, this is where I come back to perspective taking. The stuff that's interesting to people who are trying to use the existing levers of local government to perhaps make more equitable outcomes, even though that's not how they've always been used in the past, they're going to run into trouble doing that if they're not getting localized information. And because the conflicts that define local politics are often deeply held and sometimes vicious, but they don't break down neatly along partisan lines the way that almost everything nationally does. And as a result, the more in local politics you are, it's a depolarizing feature where we can actually talk to each other a little bit more. And so to the extent that we can get back to a form of local decision-making that acknowledges inequitable governance and media processes in the past, that allows, if AI is trying to flatten that out, then there needs to be a subsequent reorganization of the government, because that is fundamentally how things are done. As much as the federal government wants to think it can do whatever it wants, it's just not the case. And so I think that an acknowledgement of those governing institutions, an acknowledgement of how they've been used inequitably, and an acknowledgement of how technology might help that be addressed is going to have better outcomes than something that is ignorant of those things and basically makes the broken things move faster.
Manon, I'm going to turn to you for a second because there's a question here that is about users in different cultures. And the participant is curious about how your model might apply to users in different cultures and comment threads in different languages.
That's also a great question. So the algorithm is entirely agnostic of either the language or any information you have about the users. The only input it takes is what you can think of as a matrix of preference, which is which comments people like. And so if you happen to have a group, let's say that represents a third, or if you have 10 comments that represents a tenth of the population, and they all like comments in common, then they would, in that sense, deserve, and it's really not used in the proper way. It's in this mathematical sense. We say that they ought to have a comment that represents them, and so that would be completely taken into accounted for in the algorithm. And can I react to something that was just said earlier? I think maybe what you were saying, Sacha, I wanted to maybe push back on some of the what you mentioned in at least thinking that the social technologies don't have a potential dramatic impact on society. I kind of wonder whether the printing press or inventing writing and the printing press did have so little impact at the macro scale on our societies. And I don't know if that's the best analogy, but Reid Hoffman in his book Super Agency takes the example of the Luddite movement in England, where the sewing machine brought a dramatic change, and this was really about work, perhaps more than information dynamics. But I think it's an analogy that I think works in the work-related, potential work displacement that AI might cause. That I think did have, at least Reid Hoffman documents in the book, dramatic impact and drastic impact on how society organized. But I found the first question really interesting because I think we often think about AI as being potentially harmful to democracy, and I like the framing of thinking, can we say it's democratic because procedurally it might take into account more information than it used to, and it's not necessarily representative, but at least is it more representative than other technologies? And I found this framing interesting. And another piece from that book that I thought of, listening to your question, was this idea of AI following this iterative deployment approach that's actually being updated on the kind of information that is sampled online. And it doesn't mean that it's actually representing, because we might not have yet the good way of sampling all of the information needed, but the procedure might potentially allow for more democratic deployment or approaches. I think it's a question mark for me, but I think it's interesting to think about the other side and potentially this technologies being more democratic in a way.
More democratic, exactly.
Maybe I can quickly answer.
Please.
And of course, I'm not claiming that technology I'm not claiming, of course, that technology has no effects, and I'm not like a fully social constructionist. Like, of course, technology does stuff to society, etc. I think what I'm really interested in is, for instance, since the existence of the printing press and with the radio and stuff, there have been very similar claims about all these new technologies. For instance, information overload. Since we have been able to write books, people have been complaining about the fact that there are too many books, and so we cannot learn anything anymore, and we don't know which one to read. And this happened again every time there is a new technology, that there is too much information overload. It's as old as the first new information technology, but also same as like brainwashing and the fact that people are gullible. It was not exactly the case with book, but with the radio, it was very prominent. Like, people will listen to the radio, it's something they hear, how can they tell it's true or false? Same with the TV, like they see it, so they're going to believe it. And there have been these claims about new information technologies, about people being gullible, about information overload, and also about attention. When there were too many books or too many pieces of information, people were like, oh, so they don't read a book, they read two books. And what's going to happen if they read two books at the same time? They don't pay attention to one book. And we have that today with like the algorithmic feeds or whatever. Like, and every time there's a new technology, there are a number of claims that come up. And I think all these claims are a bit exaggerated.
As someone who generally reads 5 books at a time, I take issue with that statement. But I actually have a question. I'm going to follow up, and Ranjit, I have a question for you as well. But I want to follow up on Sacha's point, because one of the things I found myself nodding along quite a bit in reading your paper was this discussion about the technological determinism and the moral panic that ensues. And I think about it from a perspective of trying to craft workable policy in the sphere. And I'm curious about your take on that. Like, what would you tell regulators as they are grappling this? And we've all seen instances of lawmakers being completely fascinated or terrified or both by the technology and not really knowing how to address it. So I'd love your take on that. And I'd open up to all of you as well.
To be honest, I don't really know. And it's funny, most of the questions you ask are about Felix parts that Felix has written. No, to be honest, I'm not sure. Like, I'm here to. I don't have like easy solutions, or I could have some intuitions, but I don't think they are great. Sorry.
Anybody else have a thought about how do we turn this into something, the fodder for regulators that would be workable?
So there are a couple of ways in which we can do this. One is that, at its core, we are thinking about this technology as a way to take in information, process it, and give us something that basically is a transformed version of either knowing something differently through the way in which we kind of are prompting a system to basically process information, right? At the end of the day, if you kind of turn it down to the most basic of ideas around what AI is fundamentally about, it's about taking large swaths of information and then trying to figure out what are the patterns in it. So as a problem of pattern recognition, there are ways by which we can think about how questions of policy are also about thinking through what are the common features of the kinds of perspectives that people kind of bring up, and how do we actually reconcile them. The panel that we had yesterday on the Habermas machine, and that conversation around trying to think through what it means to actually bring perspectives together, is also lends itself into the insight of while there might be a lot of positioning and distinctions and polarization when it comes to holding on to a position, if you kind of talk to people and get into the weeds of it, there is a lot of agreement. And that, to a certain extent, is the way in which we can get past this particular issue of, when do we want to have a very simplified position on certain issues versus when do we respect nuance. And to some extent, this technology allows us to do both. And that is the beauty of it, in a way, that it allows us to simplify things, but at the same time, if you push it in the right direction and allow it to basically tell you the nuance of a particular issue, it can do that too. Then it becomes a matter of choice of how you want to use it and at what levels of its operation does it actually allow for the kind of deliberation that we're looking for.
Great. I'm actually going to stick with you, Ranjit, because we have a question here about your paper, and they ask, how can we balance the need for public participation in AI evaluation with the technical complexity of frontier AI safety issues that are mentioned in current risk reports?
Yeah, this is a great question. Also, because when we were talking to people who designed these events, one of the through line that we also saw was that there's this reflection on this idea that people don't want to be involved in nitty-gritty details of how to design these systems, right? What they really want is that they want to be protected. So as long as we can create a framework around which we can actually give and associate this perception of, there is investment that is going on to protect people and to ensure that their interests are heard, we can actually get to a point where we can actually have a broader conversation on what these issues look like. And that, to a certain extent, is also a very, distinct way of what experts would like to do in this space, right? So there's two sets of questions here. One is, how do we determine, what is safe? And for that, we need a broader deliberation within society in general to basically think about what safety looks like, right? And it doesn't necessarily need to move across these issues of, this is an existential threat to, now it's not a problem at all. Right? There are ways by which we can actually have these conversations which are a lot more nuanced than simplifying these positions to these specific ways in which AI safety has been thought about in the last couple of years. But at the same time, there is also this issue at hand here as to how do you actually go about doing this work, right? And in that particular sense, the way in which these events are designed, what are the ways in which we invite people in, what is the infrastructure that we are creating in order to actually have these conversations, was the interesting part of what we were observing in our report, as well as thinking through what are the design choices that go into basically making these red teaming exercises work. They require a lot of infrastructure, they require investment, they're expensive. But at the same time, it actually gives you access to a different way of thinking about some of the problems that you might have otherwise not looked at in the first place, right? And one of the interesting and curious things that came out from our research was also these particular sets of questions around what does it mean for a model to basically say something unsavory about a particular community if you are basically probing and pushing it into a direction where after 15 minutes of back and forth, it says something bad. Now, is the model bad in that particular situation, or did you induce that bias into the model by basically pushing it in that direction? And that set of questions around, is the model safe? And at what level of probing should we actually be able to surface these kinds of misbehavior are important and crucial questions in thinking about what safety means and how do we actually start thinking about organizing for some of these modalities, where part of the challenge is also that it's not just that these models need to be safer, it's also that we need to be literate and competent enough to recognize that these models produce responses that can be problematic, but at the same time, if we use them responsibly, they can also work in ways that actually allow us to do the things that we want to do a lot faster. And that trade-off between how we change ourselves and how we want to change these models and what is our relationship with these systems is basically at stake in designing a lot of these red teaming exercises.
Thank you. That's really thorough and really informative. Food for thought. So I know we have some questions from the audience here. I'd invite you to come down and just ask that we have a few minutes left. So please ask your question directly and we will get them answered.
Yeah, I have a very specific question for Joshua. You've contrasted local and national news, and it kind of came across like national news are adequately staffed and the reporting is adequate while the local news aren't. And I would take an issue with that. I'd say that there is a very strange asymmetry in national reporting where two branches of government are reported adequately, but the judiciary, and especially the way it actually operates, is not reported at all. And it operates in a very strange way, as I've discovered. Federal judges feel free to replace parties' argument in their decisions with their own argument, and they approve of their own argument. And, I've sued a bunch of federal judges for fraud, and their defense is we gave ourselves in Pearson against Ray absolute immunity for acting from the bench, quote unquote, maliciously and corruptly. And somehow you've mentioned that the journalists are trained to look at some things as news and other things as not news. When it comes to Trump and his immunity, it's news. I try to knock on every journalistic door to tell them, look, here is a co-equal branch of government that also gave themselves that similar immunity. And they're just stonewalling it and do not want to talk about it. They kind of treat judges as priesthood and kind of beyond criticism. And so my question is to you is that something normal and we should put up with it? And whether AI can break the gatekeeper, through the gatekeepers, and as other scandalous stories like priests, pedophile priests, et cetera, Me Too stories.
Let's let him. Thank you.
Okay.
Let's let him answer the question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so as somebody who's tried to make political communication syllabi, it's hard to talk about how the judiciary gets covered. The judiciary has tried to be secret because it helps them hold their power to be mysterious guardians of the law. And also because it helps to have a law degree if you're a judicial reporter, and there's not that many journalists with law degrees relative to other things. So when it comes to specialized knowledge like that and deliberate secrecy, where if you get too personal, they don't talk to you, and you can dig through the text that the reams of text that they produce to make sense of it. If to the extent that AI can help us make sense of the vast amounts of texts and citation within judicial opinions, I'm not involved with a law school, but I assume stuff like that is happening because it makes a lot of sense. I think that could be helpful. I think that the judiciary has always been the least covered branch, and so to the extent that we can break past old frameworks of journalism and think more in terms of what we can do with tools that we couldn't do before, think differently about these things, that might be possible. Certainly the judiciary is very politically important these days. But I think it's a good example of how journalism was traditionally done and how we might be able to rethink some of it.
Thank you.
Hi, I have another easy question, which is how do we make media coverage of AI less terrible? Not only do journalists lack law degrees, they lack any expertise in the technology, where the average article has one or two obvious errors that many people in the room would be able to collect. And the experts that they rely on is usually, some non-technical white guy who they find at some top name university. So curious for takes on the panel.
I think I should not take that one. I was on board till the last sentence.
Well, there are examples of good journalism in this space, and there is examples of bad journalism in this space. I personally think that, to some extent, the way in which we kind of narrate these stories have also a lot to do with the popular discourse, in a way. So you kind of turn the story about a particular kind of ways in which we need to approach AI. And, it starts with apocalypse and then it moves into other directions. And currently it's kind of in the space of infrastructural investments. So it's, to some extent, it's the vibe of the time that basically gets you to the reporting that you kind of look at. But in another moments, it's also, what does it mean to actually change the terms of the debate on which this media coverage is happening? Seems to be, the work of people who kind of work in this space, Because if you are producing this narrative of, we need to take AI safety seriously, in that moment, there are only so many arguments that can be made about why we need to take AI safety seriously, right? And we can keep saying that, okay, one thing that people will recognize is that everybody has seen Terminator, so let's talk about existential risk, right? And it makes it easier to basically make this argument in popular discourse, but it kind of takes away some of the nuance. So, and in many ways, part of the challenge that you're kind of getting at is that media coverage of AI lacks nuance. And that basically means that, to some extent, we are in a space where a lot of people who basically work on developing this tech need to be better at explaining it. And in that sense, I think I would recommend reading Ethan Malick's work. He's fairly good and basically consistently producing his Substack articles, which are fundamentally very grounded in thinking through and working on these tech by himself, right? So we need to find better examples, and we need to basically popularize them more, because it kind of allows us to think about this in a lot more nuance.
Could that also come back to the way that people absorb information now, though, as well? I mean, there's a chicken and egg issue here in terms of people having a particular way of taking in information. I think to Sacha's point earlier about how they might raise them. So I think it's a little bit of both there. Question?
Hello, thank you. I have a question for Sacha. So you mentioned that misinformation is demand-driven. So does it mean that the most effective way to reduce its spread is by changing how people consume information, so helping them become less distracted and more critically? And what are today main barriers to decrease this demand for misinformation, and what industries or mechanism can help us with this?
It's a tough question, but the way I see misinformation is mostly as a symptom of other problems. So the symptom can be various, but I don't know, if you have like very high political polarization, if you have very low trust in institutions, you will have some people who are willing to believe in misinformation, because misinformation often goes, the narratives of misinformation often goes against the mainstream narratives and institutions. And we know, for instance, that in countries like the Middle East, where corruption is on average higher than in like Nordic European countries, you have more people who believe, for instance, in conspiracy theories, just because elites are more corrupt and more likely to engage in actual conspiracies in these countries than like in Nordic countries. And so in that case, I think, dysfunctioning democratic institution is a symptom of misinformation. And in my view, we would be better off trying to improve society, like reduce inequalities and make democratic institutions work better. And I think that would be the best way, I think, to fight misinformation in the long term. I'm not against fact-checking and all this stuff, but I think they're just appeasing the symptoms. And if people are willing to believe false claims, they are going to believe false claims. Even you can fact-check as many, people will create some and others will believe it. And I'm not sure what was the first part of your question.
So the first part was basically how we can change this information consumption habits. So like my main interest is level of education and approaches to education, especially like high school and higher education can help people to evaluate information more critically. So which kind of methods and what we should focus on education to make people more thoughtful when they're working and reading some information?
Do you have a...
Go ahead, yes, I have one.
Very quickly, no, I think it's media literacy and this kind of stuff can help. I just think in recent years it has been a bit too focused on like increasing like skepticism towards the news, like explaining the biases in the news and all the ways the news can get things wrong. But by default, people are kind of like skeptical of the news and even cynical, and a lot of them are just turning away from the news. And so I think there needs to be a bit of a more positive approach to media literacy, like of course explaining the biases, but also explaining why on average they are better than, I don't know, like conspiracy theories or misinformation, so that they don't just like explain people how it doesn't work, but also why it works, in which circumstances, and why on average we are better off like trusting the New York Times than relying on our own intuitions or experiences.
Great. So
Thank you very much.
Just a little bit left. I want to ask one more question, because there are a number of them here for Manon, and I want to synthesize them into one. So the questions essentially ask you that if Meta's platforms are algorithmically optimized for engagement, and the research at Meta shows that the closer a post gets to violating platform rules, the more engagement that it gets, are you proposing putting representative ranking within the existing framework of the platforms, and how do you think that might work?
The the scope of the work for now was in this particular context of comment ranking. And as you saw specifically, the feed that we create here are non-personalized. So I think there are a lot of interesting questions that we should ask about the kind of desiderata that we want to see in, for instance, this personalized setting, which is something that we didn't touch in this work, and so that wouldn't apply to this kind of context. I think generally the way in which I think about this kind of work and how we can think about the future of ranking and thinking about interventions is having multiple tools in our toolbox and having a plurality of different objectives that we want to define. And this is something we can define democratically, and then think about how we can design systems and algorithms that meet this kind of desiderata. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists. Really appreciate each of your work, each of your presentation on your work. Thank you.